The big day of World War II in the European theater of operations was, of course, D-Day, June 6, 1944. I headed overseas as a second lieutenant a few months before D-Day and landed near Cardiff, Wales. I went as a replacement, being one of a group of them. That meant that we were not a part of any regular Army unit. We were like orphans, and we all hoped to find a home and to find one soon. Yet we felt sure that such would not occur until after Europe had been invaded, and the invading forces would suffer casualties and thereby need replacements. When we landed near Cardiff, we went to a large field filled with tents, which would hold 6 to 8 guys. It was a camp, but not in the sense of camps as existed in the United States, which had somewhat permanent buildings and barracks. It was a very temporary place, just tents. The only signs of war at that point were the lights in the sky at night when some distant city or port was being bombed. These lights were at a great distance, so we certainly were in no danger at that particular time. Soon after arriving, I did have a scare, not a war scare, but one that I remember. This happened when I decided to go into the city of Cardiff one night. A bunch of us went in an army truck. The truck was covered with a canvas, so we could only see the road behind us. Unfortunately, I tarried too long in Cardiff that night, and when I got to the spot that the truck was to leave from at 11 p.m. and return us to camp, it had already left. I didn't know the route to camp. It was at least 4 or 5 or even more miles from where I was. I didn't know the name of the camp, if it had a name. Well, I figured out what I thought was probably the way, and I started walking. Soon it started to rain, and it kept raining harder and harder. I was soaked and beginning to wonder if I'd ever find that place. I kept thinking, I've been here less than a week, and I'm going to probably be court-martialed right off. Finally, about 3 o'clock in the morning, I came to the camp. I was wet, tired, disgusted, and worried, and had to explain my lateness to the soldier at the check-in place. What a relief it was to get to bed that morning. I resolved never to get in that situation, but, of course, it did provide me with one of my memories of Cardiff, Wales. After a couple of weeks, I went to England and again joined a camp of officer replacements. Where in England, I don't know, but it was not close to any large city. Again, it was a great number of tents in a field. The field was adjacent to a large castle. The soldiers running the camp got to live in and eat in the castle. They had excellent accommodations and excellent food. Those of us living in those lousy tents and old cots had terrible food. But so it goes so often in the Army. The Army does not allow idleness, so we did take and do a lot of marching. The countryside was beautiful, and the English people very friendly. I described this in a letter I wrote to the folks and which appeared in the Peoria Star newspaper. We would sometimes meet the English Army women who were also marching. I can't think of their name, but they were similar to our WACs. Still remember that they usually sang as they marched, and some of the songs were on the naughty side. Perhaps they were trying to embarrass us or shock us. A characteristic of that locality was the numerous number of barrage balloons, large sausage-like balloons on cables to protect certain areas from low-level German plane attacks. There were so many of those balloons throughout England that it gave rise to the joke that they were really there to hold the island up. Otherwise, it would have sunk out of sight due to the weight of the enormous collection of American tanks, guns, provisions, personnel, so forth. A Lieutenant Ference and a Lieutenant Edens were two of the fellows in the tent that I was in. They were interesting people. Lieutenant Ference had represented the Army and was the U.S. national champion rifle shot. Lieutenant Edens had been part of the cadre at Camp Hood who taught the ones in officer training school, including myself, how to become a tank destroyer officer. I later learned that he was killed soon after going to France. I often wondered how Lieutenant Ference, the rifle expert, made out. One can be an expert shot and still not make it if a German soldier gets you in his sights, or a mortar or grenade or a shell lands by you. After a few weeks, our encampment was awakened around midnight by the noise of many airplanes flying over at rather low altitudes. Soon the sky was filled with them. The noise and the vibrations were terrific, and our tents never stopped shaking. This kept up for hours. We knew that the long-awaited invasion of Europe had commenced. This was the big day, D-Day. Few words came from any of us in the tent, just exclamations occasionally like, "This is it," or "This is the big one," so forth. I'm sure that each of us wondered what would become of us. When would we head for port? What would the crossing of the English Channel be like? When would we cross? What would we be assigned to as an outfit? What would be the type of outfit? And what would combat be like? The Army had trained us for these days, some of us more and some of us less. But would the training be enough? Would we pass muster? When we actually got into combat and were getting shot at, would we have the courage necessary for the circumstances? Or would we fail? I imagine that most of us could not be absolutely certain just how we would react. We would want to react as a good soldier should, but would we? In a few days, we were on the way to the ports of southern England. I don't know which port I went to, and it really made no difference to me. I knew I was at a port on the shore of England, on the English Channel, and about to cross over to participate in something beyond one's imagination. My crossing on June 12, 1944, was made in a rather small ship, outfitted to carry as many persons as possible. Bunk beds of canvas went from floor to ceiling, with just enough room to squeeze in and lay there with one's equipment, gun, knapsack, helmet, gas mask. The bunk above was about 6 to 8 inches above one's nose. Body movement was out of the question, so we lay motionless for the channel crossing. And it was probably just as well as that we didn't know what was going on outside. The crossing, however, was uneventful, and for that we were fortunate. Before very long, we were routed out of our prone positions to line up to disembark. We marched off and onto shore. We had arrived at Utah Beach. And how lucky we were to have arrived there 6 days after D-Day. No swimming or wading to shore. No one shooting at us. No dead bodies covering the shoreline. There were lots of wrecked vehicles and metal hazards and barricades the Germans had installed to prevent an invasion, but the conditions were nothing like those of the previous days. The movement inland of all incoming troops was an absolute necessity, as many troops were landing, and to have them stay on the shore would have created an impossible impasse. So our group of replacements were immediately marched inland, and we didn't stop until rather late at night. Our first night in France was spent on the ground, but this turned out to be the best place to be. We were green troops, and green troops hear things and react by shooting at the noises, real or imagined. So it was wise to lay low and make no noise. There were quite a few shots fired that night, and we weren't even close to the enemy. I wasn't aware of it at the time, but I had been assigned to the 607 Tank Destroyer Battalion. I wasn't taken to them right away, as I had landed on June the 12th, and half of that battalion landed on June the 17th, and the other half on June the 23rd. The second half had been delayed by rough water. While waiting for them, as I said, the Army does not tolerate idleness, I was assigned to a truck and a driver and had the job of transporting German POWs to the rear for interrogation. Then I was taken to the 607 TD Battalion, and as they had not yet had any casualties, there really wasn't any need for a replacement. So I was assigned as the liaison officer between our battalion headquarters and the Regiment of Infantry Division that we had been assigned to. At various times on the Cherbourg Peninsula, we were assigned to the 9th Infantry Division, the 82nd Airborne, and the 90th Infantry Division, all divisions that had a good combat record. After getting in a few miles from the beach, our Army, of course, got involved in the famous hedgerow fighting of Normandy. This was definitely not tank destroyer territory. It was mean, and the infantry fought and fought hard to make even slight progress. Our destroyers were towed 3-inch guns, that is, towed behind a half-track, such as an artillery piece would be. And they were used in Normandy primarily for indirect artillery-type firing. Normandy was an area of small farms and a lot of apple orchards. One day, one of my guys handed me a tin cup of liquid, which I assumed was cider. I took it down in one gulp, and my mouth, throat, and stomach felt like they had been invaded by a flamethrower. Actually, it was not cider, it was cognac, and the guys assumed I knew that. I hope that's what they assumed. After a while, I was able to breathe, and after some more time, the burning in my throat began to subside. My first experience with alcohol, and one not to be forgotten. For a while, I thought that my throat had suffered some permanent damage. Actually, it did, because prior to that incident, I had a beautiful singing voice. Do you believe that one? The hedgerows had played havoc with the plans of the U.S. First Army. On July the 24th, 48 days after D-Day, we were at the line that we were, or where it had been planned that we would be on the 5th day after D-Day. So we were 43 days behind schedule. On July 25, which was a nice, bright, clear day with beautiful skies, and those skies were to become even more beautiful as our planes began to appear in numbers that we were not used to. As time went by, the numbers increased dramatically. Our beautiful B-17 bombers actually filled the skies. On the ground, we just stood and watched the display of air might. There was a goodly number of German anti-aircraft shots at the planes, and occasionally a B-17 would get hit. A long line of dark smoke would come from it, and hopefully some crew members would get out in parachutes, and then the plane would make a nosedive to the ground. Of course, as we were watching, we weren't aware of just how huge that air attack was. I'll quote from Stephen Ambrose's book, Citizen Soldiers, as to the details of the number of those planes. He states that along that line going 30 to 35 miles, first came 550 fighter bombers. Those were P-47s that bombed and strafed for 20 minutes, often strafing just a half a mile ahead of our troops. Then came 1,800 B-17s, those huge bombers that struck and bombed for an hour. This bombardment was supplemented by the fire of 1,000 artillery guns, which fired some 50,000 artillery shells. As the B-17s departed, then 350 P-47s dropped napalm-filled drums. Their departure was the signal for all of us on the ground to begin the attack. And as we began, 396 Marauder bombers hit the rear of the German line. Altogether, some 16,000 tons of bombs hit the Germans, supplemented by the artillery barrage. It was the greatest expenditure of explosives for a single attack in the Army's history, up to that point, of course. This constitutes what has become well known as the breakthrough at St. Lo. What a day! A momentous day for the Allied troops who had been fighting their hearts out to get out of the hedgerows of Normandy. And now we were out. One of the surprising things of combat is the resistance that often remains after an aerial attack that would be so large one would think no living creature could survive it. But soldiers have a way of taking to foxholes and cellars and places of relative safety, so that many of them do survive such attacks. The United States ground attack after the aerial bombardment met such resistance. At the end of that day, little or no gain had been made on the ground. And the same for the American attack the next day. Nothing was gained. The following day, however, the bombing's effect did show up. And it was on the 27th that the German resistance, which was really a thin crust, gave way, and it was time for the First Army, along with the new Third Army, to go and to get across France. Our outfit then went to the new Third Army, headed by General Patton. The Germans counterattacked after the breakthrough at St. Lo, and they did go west for quite some distance, but actually that attack was headed for disaster. The German army realized this, but Hitler stood by his usual position that there would be no retreat. When he finally did allow a retreat, the Americans, the British, and the Canadians had cut off the German army that had been more or less allowed to gain ground and surrounded them. And it was a real disaster for them. I heard Eisenhower on TV once described the battle that followed as the killing fields of Europe. Some Germans did escape due to Allied blunders, but great numbers, in fact armies, were killed or captured. This all happened near the town of Falaise, so it is often called the Battle of Falaise or the Falaise Gap. And the 607 TD Battalion took part in this. At that time, we had 3-inch guns meant to destroy tanks. But at times, we were shooting at individuals with such shells, as well, of course, as armored vehicles, trucks, horse-drawn artillery, and so forth. Our platoon was on the side of a wooded hill, and at the bottom or the valley of the hill was a road that the German troops were taking. They couldn't even tell where we were and who they were getting shot by. They were in complete chaos. The infantry anti-tank guns, which are smaller guns, were shooting so often that many times the barrels would fall right out of the guns. I doubt if the German soldiers could even see where the guns were firing from that we were operating. The 3 companies of our battalion destroyed a total of 146 German vehicles in that battle, and of that number, 125 were destroyed by our own Company B. So we had a big part in that battle. The terrible conditions are still vivid in my mind, and I have some of them on tape from documentaries on TV, but almost what you would call impossible to imagine. You may not even believe what I would say when I would try to describe them, so I'm going to try to give my story more credence by again quoting from Ambrose's book. Ambrose states as follows in his book: "For sheer ghastliness in World War II, nothing exceeded the experience of the Germans caught in the Falaise Gap. Feelings of helplessness waved over them. They were in a state of total fear day and night. They seldom slept. They dodged from bomb crater to bomb crater. It was complete chaos. Along the roads and in the fields, dead cows, horses, and soldiers swelled in the hot August sun, their mouths agape, filled with flies. Maggots crawled through their wounds. Tanks drove over men in the way, dead or alive. Human and animal intestines made the roads slippery." Major William Falvey describes seeing 6 horses hitched to a large artillery gun. 4 horses were dead and 2 were still alive. The driver was dead but still had the reins in his hands. Those few men, German or American, who had not thrown away their gas masks had them on, to the envy of all the others. The stench was such that even the pilots in the Piper Cubs threw up. It was during the Battle of Falaise that I had an incident happen that still sticks in my memory. Not exactly a war or combat incident, but an incident. At night we were staying at a little farmhouse on the side of the hill, close to where our guns were. It wasn't a steep hill, and the farmhouse had been pretty well bombed out, and the barn wasn't too good a shape either. So I had the bright idea of laying my bedroll. I had no bankroll at all at that time. To lay my bedroll on the unpaved drive that led up to the house.
I'm here.
As it sloped and seemed to be just the right amount of slope downwards to make it good sleeping. The problem was that during the night, a sudden, real hard rain came along, And of course a lot of water came down the drive and right into my bedroll, which was zippered up all around except the top. By the time I realized what was happening, I was soaked. In emptied the water out of the bedroll and headed for the barn. I emptied the water out of the bedroll and headed for the barn, figuring it would be at least somewhat dry, and hopefully in a few days I could get the whole works dried out. So I laid the bedroll down and slept on top of it. In the morning I discovered I had laid the bedroll down right in a pile of fresh cow manure. I had purchased the bedroll in the States. There was no way of replacing it, so after quite a bit of work and time, the bedroll got back into usable condition. But now, with the breakthrough at St. Lo, came the time to sprint across France. The Germans were in retreat, and they seldom stopped to put up any resistance at all. We went as fast as we could. Tank destroyers, half-tracks, armored vehicles, and so forth. And of course they don't go real fast. And we kept in closed formation, each vehicle close to the one ahead. There was no fighting, so the Jeeps, even though there was no fighting, the Jeeps had no windshields. In combat, you didn't allow a windshield on a Jeep. So the dust from the vehicles ahead was killing me. And I wondered if my eyes and nose and throat and lungs would ever recover from 12 hours a day of breathing and eating dust. We often made a distance of 150 miles in a day. But no complaints, as we had it much easier than the infantry. And in most instances they had to walk the complete way. As we marched across in this manner, the vehicles would use the center of the road, and then on each side of those vehicles, the infantry would be walking, a column on each side of the vehicle. In one instance, there was an infantryman walking along one of my Jeeps who had a terrible limp and a pained expression from his sore and bloody feet. The Jeep driver offered him a ride on the fender of the Jeep, and the infantryman accepted and was enjoying a more pain-free existence, but not for long. It happened that General Patton came along, saw the fellow, screamed at him, and ordered him to get off of the Jeep and to walk like a man, not a coward. Of course, the guy got off, and maybe Patton thought that he had an image to project and to live up to. But personally, I thought he was a horse's rear end. He might have become somewhat of a human being had he developed the world's worst case of hemorrhoids at that time, which I think I wished upon him. One of the cities that we came to was the city of Le Mans. That was really familiar to all of our guys because at that time it had auto races that were of world notoriety. So everybody knew about Le Mans. We were headed in the direction of the Siegfried Line, that famous line of fortifications built by the Germans. But we weren't to reach it for a while. We crossed much of France below and near Paris, and the scuttlebutt was that the plan for us to conquer Paris was called off so General de Gaulle, the French general, could have the honor of taking it with his Free French forces, with the aid of some American forces. Anyway, we stayed south of Paris and went through many of the places so well known from World War I. Fontainebleau, Chateau Thierry, Verdun. When we got to Reims, famous for its cathedral, the Third Army ran out of gas, so we stayed there a few days, losing valuable time. Patton often claimed that he could have driven to the heart of Germany had he just been given the supplies, mainly gas, to get the job done. When we did get gas, we got going and ended up at Thionville, and that's when the German resistance began. We were in the process of trying to figure out how to get across the Moselle River when we were sent south to Metz. Much time and manpower was wasted trying to capture the city of Metz and the big fort there, Fort Driand. Fort Driand was on a dominating hill. It had been built years before and often added to and fortifications upgraded. It actually covered 355 acres of ground and was surrounded by a deep moat and just what you would describe as impossible to capture. But Patton had ordered that it be captured, and he had been noted to say that it would be captured if it took every man in the 20th Corps. He could not allow the Third Army to ever fail. Our main effort was in indirect firing at the fort, which had little or no effect. Fortunately, eventually Patton relented and did the sensible thing of bypassing that fort. And in the process, of course, became known in this instance as leading the Third Army in its first defeat in battle. Ambrose, however, mentions that there was some gain from that because it deflated Patton's ego a little bit, which needed it, as well as the Third Army's, and taught them that they had better plan more thoroughly and have the proper equipment to get the job done. Then on November the 12th, 1944, the 607 Tank Destroyer Battalion began to convert to a different kind of tank destroyer. The previous one, as I mentioned, was a towed gun, a 3-inch towed gun like an artillery piece. Now it was going to a self-propelled called the M36, which to somebody that didn't know well would think it was just a regular tank. It took about a week to get the whole battalion outfitted with these new M36s. I'll describe a little bit more about them in a few minutes, but one of the sad things in this process of changing over from one kind of destroyer to another was that the crew with the towed guns was a crew of about 9 or 10 people, whereas the crew of the tank-like destroyer was only 5. So I had to turn in the names of about a dozen fellows to be taken away from the platoon, and they would be sent to the infantry, which was about the same as signing a death warrant for them. So it was a very unpleasant task to compose such a list, and one that I wish that I hadn't had to make. As to the difference between these kind of destroyers, the M36 was much larger than the Sherman tank, which was the main Army tank, and it had a much larger gun. It had a 90 millimeter gun, which seemed or looked like it was a mile long, and that's even larger than the famous Tiger tank that the Germans had, which was an 88 millimeter. The Sherman tank had a small gun compared to it. The new M36s, as I said, looked like a tank, but had some differences. And first of all was the top of it, or the turret. The regular Sherman tanks had tops that could be closed in, so you were entirely encased in a vehicle that had no open windows or doors. The tank destroyer was designed to be an offensive weapon, not a defensive one. So the large turret at the top had an opening about 5 feet in diameter, and it had no enclosure whatsoever. So you were completely wide open at the top. And that made a big difference, especially when it came to people throwing grenades in and things like that. The new M36s were issued to all the platoons of B Company. Our platoon was not the first one to go into action with them, and I believe not even the platoon of our company, but whichever platoon went into combat with them first discovered the guns wouldn't fire. That was embarrassing to say the least, but of course, realistically, it was downright dangerous to find out after you're in battle that your guns won't fire. So all the platoons were pulled back, and the old captured pillbox was used for a target, and everyone tried each one of their destroyers to make sure that the guns did work. The few that didn't then were fixed before they went back into combat. My platoon's first real battle with the new destroyers was for the city of Saarlautern on the Saar River. And at Saarlautern there were some 3 bridges across the Saar River, and at that point the Army wanted desperately to capture intact any bridges over any rivers, so to hasten their entry into the heart of Germany. To make an attack on rubber bridges or whatever the engineers would make slowed you up, and so it was important to try to capture the bridges. 2 of the bridges at Saarlautern had already been destroyed by the Germans. The 3rd one in the heart of town had not. Well, before attacking the city, we were all stopped on the top of a hill that overlooked the city and waited for a lot of P-47s to bomb the place. They did a lot of bombing, and we figured it would be a simple task then to go down and take the city. But not so. Like I mentioned before, there was all kinds of resistance even after such a bomb attack. My platoon was assigned to an area on the southwestern edge of town, an area that must have been under direct fire and direct vision of the Germans, as they were peppering us well. We worked with the infantry, and on one occasion I went to an infantry command post to discuss the situation with them and coordinate our efforts to see how to get the situation taken care of. This was about 1/3 of a mile from my guns, and on the way back I realized that they had me in their sights and were firing. That is, the Germans. I was following a creek line, and the only thing that I could do to stay alive was to travel in the creek bed, and most of the time had to be crawling on my belly. And the creek had several inches of water, and it was now cold weather. This meant I was soon to be soaked and wet and cold. But the other alternative wasn't any good, so I chose to be uncomfortable and crawled the rest of the way to the guns. I was in the process of placing my destroyers to fire at a certain area about 1/2 mile away, which contained a lot of German Tiger tanks. The tanks began firing at us first, so I increased the speed which I was going to try to get and talk to them and yell at my tank commanders as to where I wanted them to place their guns. This was primarily between houses, but I wanted them between certain houses. Many days later, the corporal gunner of one of those tanks, of one of those destroyers of mine, told me something that had happened at that time. He said that just as he pressed the mechanism to fire that 90mm gun, a shell big enough to penetrate most tanks, my head appeared in his gunner's sight. Fortunately for me, the mechanism to shoot electronically didn't work. Evidently, the firing mechanism still had some bugs in it. He could use the gun, and did, but he had to fire it manually, using a different mechanism. He said the experience left him shaking for hours. It would have me too had I known of it at the time. I don't think he wanted to kill me, first of all, and secondly, he would have probably had a hard time trying to explain why he had taken his platoon leader's head off. The incident was entirely my fault, of course, and not at all the fault of the gunner. One rule that is never to be broken is that you don't go in front of a gun that is in the process of being used. My desire to get all my destroyers in the right place and in a big hurry resulted in my violation of that rule. Once again, I was very lucky. Of course, I didn't spend any time criticizing the people who made a gun that would fail to fire as designed at times. The next day, December 3, my platoon was ordered to go to the center of the city where the infantry had just captured intact a bridge across the Saar River. This was big stuff. My company commander told me not to cross the bridge, however, until the infantry had gone over the bridge with mine detectors. If there were any explosives on the bridge, it was felt that the destroyers in their weight would set them off and destroy both the destroyer and the bridge. This was about noon, and I had my 4 destroyers lined up just by the bridge, a few feet from it, ready to cross when it became cleared of mines. I was in that position for less than 5 minutes when my company commander called me again on the radio and said the situation was too pressing and imperative to wait, so I was to cross before it had been checked for mines. We did cross immediately, slowly, 1 destroyer at a time. I was in the lead destroyer, and it was like trying to cross on your tiptoes and without putting any weight on the ground. We feared every second that we would result in just one big explosion. But all 4 of my destroyers got across and without any incident. Later it was found that there were enough explosives under the bridge to blow at the Kingdom Come, but that the infantry had crossed the river the night before, killed the guard, and had cut the wires to the demolition charges. Thank goodness they were not set off by the weight of our tanks. I use the word tank sometimes to refer to our destroyer. I'll usually try to call them destroyers, but they looked and to most people seemed so much like a tank that we often called them that. The infantry had crossed the bridge and so now had my destroyer, so we had a small bridgehead, probably about 1 square city block across the only bridge that had ever been captured intact over the Saar River. That was a significant thing, and the Germans, we knew, would be making counterattacks to try to destroy that bridge. In the meantime, I'm sure that the big shot generals were elated that there was now a bridgehead across that river. Well, the Germans did counterattack. The first German tank was hit and destroyed right on the street where we were, and by that time I was on the 2nd floor of a barracks-type building where I had a good view of the German attack and had radio contact with my destroyers so I could direct them on where the tanks were coming from and when to fire and so forth. I told the one tank to go out just far enough from behind a brick wall to fire at an advancing German tank. At this very time, that German tank, which had been destroyed and was in the street, began to burn, and the dark smoke made it impossible for my tank driver to see around it. So instead of just barely pulling out from around the wall, he pulled clear out and advanced down the road. He didn't get far when a shell from one of the German tanks, or more than one, hit the destroyer hard enough to put the radio out of commission, so I no longer had contact with them or any of my destroyers. The destroyer kept advancing, however, and then received a hit on one of his tracks. When that occurs, the track usually breaks, and in this case it did. So after traveling another approximately 5 feet, the tank or the destroyer drove right off of its track and could go no further. So there it sat in the street, a sitting duck to the Tiger tanks that were firing. By then, several of my platoon, along with some infantrymen, were in a machine shop factory, which was right on the street and directly across and only perhaps 30 feet from my disabled destroyer. The destroyer took several more shots, and we soon discovered that one of the shots had gone right through the front of the destroyer where the assistant driver sits, and of course killed him. The gunner is always right behind the assistant driver, and the shell in this case had gone on in and hit the leg of the gunner, a Corporal Eugene LaFountain, and took his leg off just below the knee. The destroyer then began to burn, as tanks and destroyers often do when they're hit. The rest of the crew, except the gunner, LaFountain, and of course the assistant driver, who was dead, climbed out the turret and ran to our factory where we were located and climbed in through the window. We were amazed to see that our destroyer still kept firing, and later discovered that Corporal LaFountain had stayed in despite the loss of his leg and had loaded and fired by himself that 90mm gun until he ran out of ammunition. And those shells are huge, about 3 foot in length and 5 inches in diameter, and heavy. Then he crawled to the top of the turret and fell to the ground. A couple of the guys ran out with a stretcher and brought him into the factory by way of a window. As he was carried through the place, he often had to be raised over some of the large pieces of machinery, and this was quite a task. And each time I heard him say to the guys, "God bless you." For this he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest Army award, second only to the Congressional Medal of Honor. I would add that Corporal LaFountain was a terrific gunner. He could aim and get the shell off so fast that he acquired the nickname that we all knew him by of Pooper. Pooper LaFountain, we called him. He could really poop those shells out. That was the end of his Army life, of course. Eventually he went back to his hometown of Spokane, Washington. I understand that he bought a truck and used it in some business he started, and then the business increased and he had several trucks. The one he drove, he had the foot pedals redone to accommodate his driving without a leg. And he died just a few years ago. I hope the people of his town knew what a courageous man he was. We knew that there would be more counterattacks to regain that bridge or to destroy it, and those attacks would probably be by tanks. And that, of course, would be something for us, the tank destroyers, to take care of. There were 2 or 3 ways to get to the area around that bridge, and I had to find the locations for my 4 destroyers so that they would be able to block any entry by any tanks coming down any of those 2 or 3 ways. In other words, deploying the destroyers was the thing of prime importance. The factory that I had mentioned, a rather small one, a 1-story building, was on the main street leading to our area and to the bridge. And it was on this street that the first attack had come and had been repulsed. Down from the factory, about a half a block, was a nice big long brick building that looked like it could be a college dormitory, but it wasn't. At the end of that building, the end furthest from the Germans and the closest to the bridge, is where I decided that a destroyer should be set, right alongside the building, so that it could not be seen by any Germans attacking down the street again, and yet it could have a muzzle of that long 90mm gun that would only be a matter of about 10 or 15 feet from any vehicle coming down the street. About midnight on that same day that LaFountain was injured, we heard a noise, first barely perceptible, but whatever it was coming down that street. Hadn't gotten to the factory yet. And getting closer. The infantry officer I was working with and I were listening together, and we soon became certain that it was a German tank, moving as slowly as it could and as quietly as it could. He thought that his troops should probably start firing right away at that tank, but I suggested that their rifle fire would not do much good against the tank and would do nothing but alert them or others. so suggested that the tank be allowed to keep on going down the street until it was right in front of that 90mm gun that I had stationed at the side of that long brick building, and he agreed. By then we could tell that the tank was covered with German personnel, and none of them were making a sound. Well, I ran as fast as I could down to where my destroyer was and explained the situation to the crew, telling them that in just a minute or two a German tank would be coming down that road, and as soon as it appeared in their sight, to take it out. I stood on the ground alongside that destroyer in what seemed to be an eternity. The only noise came from the tracks of that slow-moving tank, and the noise was barely audible. Those rascals had planned to make a sneak attack, one we wouldn't even be aware of. Well, the moment did come when that tank, covered with German soldiers, appeared right in the front of the end or muzzle of our gun. I waited, but there was no shot from our destroyer. What's the trouble, I thought. Good grief. My mind was going crazy. I couldn't yell at my crew who were inside the destroyer, or the Germans just a few feet away would have been alerted and we'd all been dead ones. The German tank kept moving ever so slowly, and still no firing by my destroyer. What on earth is the matter with him? Finally, I saw the turret of our gun move to the left so that it would be pointing right at the tank, and it fired. The muzzle blast from our gun almost took me off the ground. Then more shots. The German tank, we discovered right away, was loaded with both soldiers and explosives, intended to get to the bridge, the soldiers that is, and to destroy it with those explosives. Well, when our shells hit the tank, it set off those explosives, and enough to blow up a bridge, and many times more than necessary to blow up a tank. It was like the 4th of July. The fireworks were tremendous, and it lit the place up like the middle of day. Those poor Germans that were riding on the tank went flying through the air in bits and pieces. Often the pieces were large enough to identify what they were, like an arm or a leg. As the saying goes, they never knew what hit them. The fireworks actually continued for quite a while, as those fellows had brought a large amount of explosives to blow that bridge up. And that attack, that sneak attack, of course, came to no good end for them. It was here at Saarlandern that I earned my first Silver Star. The next day, Lieutenant Richard Reynolds of Memphis, Tennessee, brought his platoon of destroyers across the bridge. It was his assignment to help enlarge the bridgehead by going beyond the little area where my troops were stationed into the next section of town. And that next section is where the German tanks, both Tiger and otherwise, had been firing from and attacking from. I understood that he stopped at where my guns were located for a few minutes, but I happened to be at another destroyer a bit away and didn't realize that he was there. I regretted not seeing him, as I would have told him about those tanks there and to be a little bit cautious. It would have had no effect on him, however, as he was the bravest, most courageous, most risk-taking soldier I had ever known, or ever did know. I worked with him a lot, so had occasion to see what he did and what he was like. He had absolutely no regard for his own safety, only for the safety of his own men and for doing what was needed to be done to defeat the Germans. He was the most decorated man of our battalion. How he had lived up to that point is something that I never could figure out. Well, either that day or the next day, as he was directing the fire of his destroyers upon enemy pillboxes, he was shot and killed. And just before that, he had, while engaged with German soldiers, halted his destroyer, the one he was in an exposed position, and personally rescued members of another crew who were trapped in a burning tank destroyer. See what I mean? What a soldier he was. Our country owes him, and ones like him, a mighty big debt. And of course, very few, other than those who served with them, even know it. Which is all right, I guess. They didn't do what they did for any fame or acclaim. The Germans were never able to mount a successful attack to regain or destroy the bridge. And after some tough street and house fighting, more house-to-house fighting than in the streets, they were gradually pushed out of town. It was here that my security section, which had the job, among others, to man the bazookas, learned that it was much safer to avoid the sidewalks and the streets and to go from house to house. The houses were built close together, so they discovered that by using their bazookas, they could blow big holes in the walls of the houses, the side of the houses, so they would just walk safely from one house to another through those holes. A little bit hard on the tanks, but much easier on the personnel. In street fighting, one usually stays off the street. Well, the best street fighting is to stay off the street. And if you do have to be there, to cross in a hurry and to either crawl or crouch down. And I know there was one time when it seemed like a person wasn't a human anymore. If you went down a street, you had to crawl or run or crouch over, and you felt more like a rabbit that was being hunted than a human being. And often felt like going down the street with your head up and your shoulders back like a human being, but of course those thoughts are soon dismissed out of practicality. This was December now. It was winter and it was cold. One day after we'd gone through Saarlandern to the town that was adjoining it, I was there at a brick factory, which was mainly the open part of the brick factory, with 3 infantry officers, and we were discussing how to handle the situation if the Germans attacked at that particular area. To our left was a machine gunner. He was sitting behind a machine gun and ready to shoot any Germans that came attacking right then. Of course, his head would have been about equal to a person's knee if you were standing. And as I say, he was just a few feet to our left. As we were talking, all of a sudden some mortar fire came in, and it was evident that the pieces of the mortar shell were hitting us about knee height. One piece or several pieces went through the machine gunner's head, and it killed him. And then of the ones I was standing with, one a piece of a shell went through his knee, and I suppose that was the end of the war for him. Another fellow had a piece hit him in the seat, but he had so many clothes on, and it wasn't one with a lot of force, so all it did was kind of make a big thud and didn't break the skin or even the clothing. I didn't feel anything, so I felt quite fortunate. That evening, we were in a house. There was about a week when we were lucky enough to be in an abandoned house to sleep at night. And as I say, it was winter and I had a lot of clothes on. And when it came to trousers, I had, well, first of all was my long woolen underwear, which fits skin tight, of course. Then a regular pair of winter OD pants. And then over that, and the shirts I was wearing, was the tank combat outfit. They're like a pair of coveralls, real heavy and nice, real neat looking, and lined with what looks like an army blanket and a jacket. And it was one of those nights when we were lucky enough to be able to get down to our underwear and get in the bedroll without all those clothes. So that night, as I was getting ready to go to bed, and I'm taking my combat jacket or pants off, I realized there's a hole right at my knee. And I thought, holy smokes, I must have got hit just like the other guys did at that point. So I finished taking that combat jump overalls off, and looked at my OD pants, and there's the hole at that same spot right at my knee. And I thought, by gosh, I have been hit. Took the pants off in a hurry and looked at my long woolen underwear. Not a hole. So lucky. Had I been standing an inch one way or another, I'd been hoping for a new knee replacement, but I don't think they had them in those days. After a few more days, we actually went more on the defensive in Saarlandern. Up to that time, it had been purely offensive. Part of this was due to the fact that the Battle of the Bulge had started up north on December the 16th. And when that battle started, the Germans invaded. The generals of the Allied forces were not certain at all that that was where they were going to make their main attack. Quite a few of those generals thought that they were just making an attack up there as a diversion, and that actually the main attack would come further to the south where we were. And it was actually some time before they had decided that the attack up north was the main one, and that was what the Germans were going to try to end the war with. But down where we were, it still hadn't been determined, and so one day our company commander got us together and told us that we had a certain area to defend, and if the Battle of the Bulge was just a diversion and the main German attack came in our sector, we were to take a position to halt the attack the best we could, and there would never be any retreating. And our tanks, or our destroyers that is, were to pick a place to form on that line. Then they would dig or actually dynamite a big hole for our tank to go into so that there was nothing but the gun above the surface of the ground. So we're sort of a pillbox. And if the attack did come from there, we were to fire until we were all dead or out of ammunition, but not to retreat. It was kind of a funny feeling because you thought, uh-oh, if the real attack does come down here, we're not going to last too long. But I had the positions and the holes for all four of my tanks, and we were ready. So it was a matter of sort of waiting to see what would happen, and so actually we went into a reserve position for a while. And nothing did happen, so it was a kind of a restful reserve. And at that time, one of the fellows that I liked real much in my security division, but I had a problem with, a fellow by the name of Angelo Pistolesi. He came from the Bronx in New York. A real likable guy, heavy-set guy. He was fat, in fact. And he was, as I said, in my security division, and one of his main jobs was to handle a bazooka when it was needed. And whenever I needed a man with a bazooka, I could never find Angelo. He was always off somewhere else, and usually going through some vacated German house to try to gather some loot. And I'd had just about enough of that, and I thought, well, I'll fix him. So as we went into a reserve position, I called Angelo in one day and said, I'm reassigning you now. I'm making you an assistant driver on one of my destroyers. The assistant driver, if his head's out of the tank, it's right across from the driver at the front of the vehicle, and the hole that you go in and out of there would not accommodate a man of Angelo's size. And if the destroyer gets hit, and especially if it gets on fire, that's the only way the assistant driver can get out. You could get through the turret, but it's too cumbersome and take too much time. He realized right away that that was not a good position for him to be in. And he said, but Lieutenant, I'm too big to get in and out of that entryway for the driver. I said, I know you are, Angelo, but you can always use the turret. He said, but I said, you're assigned as assistant driver. So that was the job that he was given. Well, later, a week or so later, when we did go into an attack, I changed him back to his original job, but I never had any problem with him after that. He was always available with that bazooka because he knew he'd get reassigned to be assistant driver, and that was something he didn't want to be at all. In fact, he might have sweated enough pounds off to have made it in and out of that driver's hole. So it worked with him. It was getting close to Christmas. This had been our first Christmas away from home for all of the troops. And we had a chance, since we were on reserve, to enjoy a little bit of it. We took advantage of some of the evergreens in those German yards. Of course, the homes are all vacated. The civilians are not in a town like that when they're fighting for it. So we cut a few evergreens down and took them in and made Christmas trees and had some decorations in them for each tank. And as I've mentioned on some occasions, I found an ice cream freezer, the old kind you crank. And I could recall from my farm days on the farm how Mom made ice cream. So I sent to the rear for the ingredients to make ice cream. And we got the ice from the shell holes because they'd gather water and then it'd freeze and we had ice. And so I made a freezer of ice cream. That ice cream freezer was then given to each tank to keep for a week or two, and they would make ice cream. And we became the only tanks going around the ETO with an ice cream freezer hanging on the outside. And the fellows appreciated it, and it made a somewhat decent Christmas for us, although we had lost a lot of guys and a lot of, some tanks and vehicles. So it was a Christmas that needed some cheer in it. On January, after having, as I say, some time on reserve, we were ordered to join with the 95th Infantry Division to go up to Belgium, to assemble in Belgium north of Bastogne. Bastogne had been the key town, publicity-wise and army-wise, of the Battle of the Bulge. And we were to assemble up there, and we marched, but this was after the Battle of the Bulge. We marched 150 miles on the coldest day of winter to arrive up there and to help close in on the Germans who were then withdrawing. They had lost the Battle of the Bulge, and they were withdrawing and heading for their homeland. And it was our job, along with the 95th Infantry Division and then the 87th, to do something about those Germans in our particular area. We were assigned, Company B, that is, of our Tank Destroyer Battalion, was assigned to a regiment of the 87th Infantry Division along the Schnee-Eifel Ridge. And there were the fortifications of the Siegfried Line there also. This is the third time that we had attacked the Siegfried Line, and it was getting a little bit tiresome. The first time we attacked it, we were shown the sketches of the entire Siegfried Line, and with little circles like for each fortification. And the first time we attacked it, we were at the thickest line of fortifications in the entire line. And here we were back again. And of course, we were popular for that job because our 90-millimeter guns would help destroy some of those pillboxes. Not always be able to do it, but often could. And hardly any other guns could do it that were available to the infantry. It was there and at that time, on February 7th, that I got my second Silver Star. The weather at that point was lousy. The road conditions were terrible. Sometimes you had to take logs from trees and so forth to try to make a muddy road, passable for tanks. Tanks don't do well on either ice or mud. We were crossing one time what they called a mountain, we'd call it a high hill. And ice had formed on the road, and we found out right away that our tanks had no control whatsoever. If the ground slanted, that's the direction the tank went to. Didn't make any difference which direction you were trying to drive it. That resulted in somebody's bright idea to weld little round buttons like a metal onto the tracks, little spikes like. So that was done to all the tanks, and that saved the day. It seems like whenever you run into a problem in combat, there's always somebody that has an idea that will help the situation. I had always figured that tanks would go through ice and mud like nothing, but they don't go through it at all. And so the conditions were bad, and we were allowed time to try to fix roads and get our machinery in shape, and the attack was to begin, and did begin, on February the 26th. And I didn't have a whole lot to do with that attack, because the next day, as we were going through some woods and trying to make some headway in the enemy that was resisting terrifically, I was inside the lead tank when a shell hit the tree above our destroyer, and that, of course, causes a tree burst, so that artillery shell goes into a million little pieces. And as I said, the turret in our destroyer was about 5 foot in diameter and wide open. So if a shell goes and hits a tree just above you, it's all going to shower down inside. And inside it came. Later I noticed that it had gone through a piece of steel just behind the gun that you'd think was steel, couldn't be penetrated, and it had torn that like it was a piece of paper. Well, I realized that I had been hit by one of those fragments. And later I was kind of ashamed of myself, but as soon as I was hit, I couldn't realize at first how bad of that. But I did, like about everybody else, I guess, I gave a big yell for the medics. Later, when I realized that I was not seriously injured, I was ashamed of myself, because the guys yelling for a medic should be more seriously hurt than I was. But anyway, there weren't any medics around, so it didn't divert any of them. The first thing I did to take care of the platoon was to call the first sergeant over and tell him to take command. And then I went to where the medics were, about a half a mile away. And they loaded me into an ambulance along with a bunch of others, and I was off to one of those hospitals in a tent, field hospital, I guess they call them. Later, it seemed to me like a place just like on that MASH program. I had been hit in the arm with a piece of shell fragment, and it wasn't bad at all. Wasn't causing a whole lot of pain, but I do recall that ride in the ambulance to the field hospital over those bumpy roads made me sicker than a dog. But I got to that field hospital, and they took good care of me there. I guess opened up my arm, and at least when I woke up, I had a cast on my arm. And then the next day, they sent me on a hospital train to Paris. And that's not all bad at all. Paris is a much nicer place to be than where I had just come from. But wherever I was, I had to look around and feel for the fellows that were seriously hurt, and there were a lot of them. And in the various hospitals, the worst injuries seemed to me to be those people who were in a Jeep when they hit a landmine. It didn't seem to kill them, but they were bandaged from head to toe. They looked like a mummy. And I soon learned that wasn't the place to be when you hit a landmine in a Jeep. It's not too bad in a tank. All it'll do is break the tank, the track of the tank, and you're disabled, but a Jeep is terrible. Well, I got to this hospital at Paris, actually a suburb of Paris, St. Cloud, just like St. Cloud, Minnesota, except over there they called it St. Cloud. A beautiful new hospital, French hospital. Oh, it was a dandy. And coincidentally, as I checked into the hospital, the first nurse I saw was a nurse by the name of Mildred Pretty. And she lived just across the street from us back in Peoria. Across from where the folks were and where I lived, going into the Army. So she welcomed me, and I got admitted into the hospital and so forth. And it was a good thing that I did meet her, because she got a hold of her folks So they would tell my folks that I was in the hospital there and why I was there, and that I had just a slight injury to my arm. And my folks said that her folks came over. It was rather late at night. I think they were in bed and woke them up by hitting the bedroom window and tapping on it. And they said that I had been injured, but slightly, and was in the hospital and so forth. It was a big help because a day or two later they got a telegram from the War Department, which I read later. And the telegram was worded to where you would have thought I was half dead. So they would have been worried to death had they received that telegram without an explanation coming from Mildred Preddy's folks. They discovered at Paris that my arm was not broken, that the shell fragment had hit a bone and chipped it, but was still in my arm, so they operated and removed the shell fragment and bandaged it all up, and I was in pretty good shape. In fact, I could walk around as well as anybody else. And so I was ambulatory and had the occasion to take the train into Paris several times, which was enjoyable. A terrific hospital, and the personnel were terrific. As I say, I mainly commiserated for those who were in there for such serious injuries as were around all over the place. I do recall one day a German prisoner of war that was going to be operated on, screaming and yelling to where you wouldn't believe it. And I couldn't figure out why he was being taken to be given an anesthetic for surgery. I later learned that there was a rumor among the German prisoners that they were operated on by the Americans without giving them an anesthetic. And I can see why that guy was yelling as they're hauling him down the way. But that wasn't the case. They were given anesthetics just like all of us were. I remember I was given sodium pentothal, which I think was new at that time. Later, they called that the truth serum, and I often wonder what I told them when they gave that to me. After I was there for a while, I think the Army has a policy: you're in a certain hospital so long, and if you aren't ready to go back to fighting, they just send you more to the rear. And evidently I wasn't ready yet when the time came. It was somewhat slow in healing. As I say, it wasn't serious, but after I'd had that cast on for so long and they took it off, I couldn't move my arm except to right angle. I couldn't extend it full way, and I thought for a while I was going to lose, the use of my arm, sort of. Just be able to unbend it one way. But that nurse at physical therapy, a lady nurse who I think could have played for the Chicago Bears football team, when she got done pulling my arm and that in this water therapy, that thing straightened around and came out and extended fine. But after a while, then I was sent to a convalescent hospital in England. Went over by plane, a beautiful flight. The fields of France were so pretty. And I don't know where that convalescent hospital was in England. In those days, they had the names of the towns and the signs all removed in case of a German invasion. And it didn't make much difference to me where I was, but I think I might have been near Birmingham, England. And that was mainly a recovery stage. I met a young man from Peoria there that had gone to Roosevelt, as I had. And it was quite enjoyable. We weren't real sick condition there, so there were a lot of fun things to do. I went to Stratford-on-Avon in a bus one day to see one of Shakespeare's plays. One day the chaplain asked if I wanted to go with him to a convention of chaplains somewhere in England. And I said, yeah. He said he had an English chaplain lined up to drive the Jeep because he knew where the rock was that is the inspiration for the song Rock of Ages. And he said, there'll be a chance to see that place. That didn't work out. The English driver kept asking directions to that rock, and the English people in these little villages would give directions and always end up saying, you can't miss it. But we missed it all afternoon. Never did find it. But we did go to the Conference of Chaplains. In the Army, if you have a problem or you begin complaining, your fellow men will usually say, listen, just go tell it to the chaplain. The theory being that everybody told their problems to the chaplain. Well, most of these chaplains were from Air Force bases, and the Air Force people were being transferred to the infantry because of the huge casualties in the Battle of the Bulge, and of course they thought they were going to be dead within a week. So they were overloading the chaplains with their grievances. The chaplains were getting so many complaints, and they had no place to go with them. I felt like suggesting to them that they might go to God in some prayer, but evidently they wanted something more immediate. But anyway, the chaplains were very stressed out. I've never heard such a large group of stressed out people in my life. I can imagine, though, how those airmen felt about being transferred to the infantry right when they'd be used for gunpowder. So that was another experience while I was in England. Not too many other experiences, but then it came time to be discharged from the hospital, and I was told that whenever you left that hospital, you were entitled to 2 weeks of leave, and you could travel anywhere in the British Isles. And of course, being a soldier in uniform, you never had to pay for anything, the train fare or anything. So it would have been a terrific opportunity. The only thing that kept me from taking that proposition, the war had ended in Europe. And I had been a replacement before I got to the 607 Tank Destroyer Battalion, but it became home for me. And as soon as the war ended, we didn't think so much about going home as the fact that we'd no doubt be sent over to Japan now to fight them. And I did not want to go as a replacement. I wanted to be with my unit. So I said, no, thank you. I want to get back to my unit as fast as I can get there. And so they sent me back. Went on a small boat. I remember meeting a fellow that I had got to know in officers' training school back in Camp Hood, Texas. And he was coming over. He was just getting there. And I thought, holy smokes, he's missed the whole darn thing. I couldn't hardly imagine a fellow arriving after the war was over. But I realized a lot of them never got out of the States. It's just that I hadn't met one before, and it was just sort of impossible to believe. So we took a boat back to France, and then they loaded us on a train. And you've heard of those trains in World War I, the 40 and 8, where, it'd hold, 40 people or 8 cattle or 8 horses or something? Well, this is a miserable thing to ride in. It was just a boxcar, like a freight car with maybe 50 guys in it. But in any event, I was headed for my outfit, and they at that time were on the Czechoslovakian border. And so I got to them, and I remember the day of arriving back to my outfit. The first night I was taken to battalion headquarters, and I got to talk to the colonel that ran the battalion. I never really got to know him during the war because all our platoons and companies were separated. We didn't get to know each other. But I had sort of a reunion with him that evening. He was in some nice, I was sort of like a castle. Everybody seems to go for the castles over there. And I learned who had been killed since I left and what all had happened. I learned that the company commander I had, who had saved my life on many occasions, had been killed by a sniper. And I remember the colonel, it was candlelight, there was no electricity, and it was late in the evening. He offered me a drink, and it was sort of sentimental, sitting around and talking with that big shot colonel and being welcomed back. And so I thought, well, I can't say no, so I took it. That had been my second drink. The first one was of cognac that like to kill me. I drank that, and then he gave me another one, and actually I didn't think it had any effect on me. I went to get up to go to the room they had assigned me to, and I had to hold onto the wall to get down to the room. So I realized that on my second occasion of having liquor, I had had too much. But anyway, it was a nice homecoming. Then the next day I went back to the platoon and found out from them who all had been killed and what had happened and some of their experiences after I had left. It was an emotional thing, of course, to be joined back and to realize that the war, at least in Europe, was over. And so there we sat, and we didn't sit very long until the war ended in Japan. So Before that, however, as I said, the Army never lets you sit idle. And they realized they had all these people, there's no war to fight. It'd take a long time to get them assigned over to Japan and shipped over, and you can't just let troops sit down and do nothing. Then they get into troubles. So somebody devised a school system of a sense, where you would find somebody that could teach something like electricity or whatever, and have classes in it. The battalion wanted a person to head that school up, and whoever was to head it up went to the University of Paris for, I think, 10 days or 2 weeks. Well, the war was over in Europe, and I knew my brother was stationed at Chantilly, France, just a few miles out of Paris, and I was anxious to see him. I hadn't seen him for a long time. So I volunteered for that job just so I could get to Paris. And so I have attended the University of Paris. I tell that once in a while. I never say it was only for 10 days or 2 weeks, but at least I attended the University of Paris and had a chance to meet my brother Dwayne, and we saw the sights of Paris and just had a good time. When I got back to the outfit, of course, I'm to be the head of the school, and they had made books. They looked like the training manuals of the Army. And just like the Army, they had enough books, it seems like, for a division rather than a battalion. They had oodles of books. Well, about that time, the war ended in Japan, and nobody was interested in reading anything. All they wanted to do was go home. So the school never really started. I got my training, and the textbooks were printed, but that's as far as it went. I'd found teachers that I needed, but that was the end of school, and from then on it was just a matter of trying to get home. And from then on, you never stayed with an outfit. They assigned the order of getting home depended on how long you were in the Army, how long you were overseas, and what medals you received. You all got points for that, and so the person with the most points would go first and then down the line. And they kept assigning you to outfits to where you would get the one where they all had about the same number of points and would get home at the same time. So I was transferred to 2 or 3 different tank destroyer battalions before I got on the one that got on the boat, and we got home. And the war was over, and the Army has a good way of doing things. I know when we got up to Chicago to get mustered out, they said if you have any claims about disability from any injuries or so forth, then you stay over for a couple of days and we'll process them. Well, I didn't think I would have any claim about my arm, but when they said stay over a couple of days, that cinched it. I, of course, made no claims, and I think that was their way of eliminating about 80% of the people that would have made claims. Another day in the Army was unthinkable. So I met my wife, Mildred, then in Chicago. She came up, and that was the end of the war for me and for her, and most fortunate for me. So many close calls, but I made it home, and so many didn't. So that's the story, at least in part, of World War II as far as I was concerned.